Sleep medication is often treated as something simple, almost mechanical. A small pill taken at night with the quiet expectation that consciousness will gently fade, rest will arrive on schedule, and the body will reset itself by morning, as if sleep were a switch that could be turned off and on without consequence. For many people, these medications feel like a solution rather than an intervention, a way to restore something that feels broken without having to think too deeply about what sleep actually is, how it emerges, or what the brain is doing while the body appears to be at rest. What rarely enters the conversation is that sleep is not a passive state, and that the brain does not shut down when you fall asleep, but instead shifts into a complex sequence of activity, coordination, and internal communication that follows its own timing, rhythms, and priorities, none of which were designed to be bypassed or compressed. Sleep medication does not create sleep in the way the brain naturally does, but rather alters consciousness, awareness, and responsiveness, creating a state that can feel similar on the surface while operating very differently underneath, often without the person taking it ever being told where those differences lie. This distinction matters because what feels like rest is not always the same as restoration, and what feels like sleep is not always the same as the brain doing the work it normally performs during the night. Most people take sleep medication trusting that it simply helps the brain do what it was already meant to do. But the reality is quieter, more nuanced, and far less discussed. And once you understand how sleep medication actually interacts with the brain, it becomes difficult to see it as a neutral shortcut rather than a powerful signal that changes how sleep itself is experienced. Sleep medication matters because sleep itself is not just a period of unconsciousness, but a carefully timed biological process that the brain uses to regulate emotion, consolidate memory, recalibrate attention, and restore internal balance, meaning that anything that alters how sleep begins, unfolds, or ends will also influence those underlying processes, even if the surface experience feels familiar. For someone struggling to fall asleep, the relief provided by medication can feel immediate and necessary, especially when exhaustion accumulates and nights begin to blur together. But this relief often masks a deeper question about what kind of sleep is actually being achieved, and whether the brain is able to move naturally through the stages it relies on to perform its nightly work. Because sleep medication primarily affects awareness and responsiveness, it can shorten the time it takes to lose consciousness without necessarily reproducing the brain's natural rhythm of cycles, transitions, and depth, which means that the feeling of having slept and the benefits of having slept are not always aligned. This matters during the day when attention feels fragile, memory feels less reliable, and emotional responses seem harder to regulate, because these functions depend heavily on specific phases of sleep that are not guaranteed simply because the body remains still for several hours. Over time, reliance on sleep medication can quietly reshape expectations around sleep itself, teaching the brain to associate rest with external assistance rather than internal signals, which can make natural sleep feel increasingly distant, unfamiliar, or difficult to access without help. This shift is rarely intentional and rarely discussed, yet it influences how people think about their own bodies, their resilience, and their capacity to rest without intervention. Understanding how sleep medication fits into the larger picture of how the brain sleeps is not about discouraging its use, but about recognizing that sleep is not a single outcome and that how it is reached can shape what it ultimately provides. To understand how sleep medication fits into the brain's functioning, it helps to see sleep not as a single state, but as a sequence of transitions the brain moves through each night, guided by internal timing systems, chemical signals, and coordinated neural activity designed to support restoration rather than simple unconsciousness. During natural sleep, the brain cycles through different stages, each serving a specific purpose, with lighter phases allowing disengagement from the environment, deeper phases supporting physical restoration, and particular periods associated with memory consolidation and emotional processing, all unfolding in a rhythm that depends on timing and continuity rather than speed alone. Sleep medication does not recreate this structure from the ground up, because its primary effect is to reduce alertness and responsiveness, making it easier to lose consciousness without necessarily guiding the brain through the same internal sequence it would normally follow on its own. In this sense, medication often acts more like a detour than a replacement, altering the route into sleep rather than reproducing the process itself, which helps explain why someone can remain unconscious for hours and still wake up feeling mentally dull or emotionally flat, even when the night appeared uninterrupted. The brain's sleep systems are highly sensitive to balance and timing, And when these signals are externally modified, the sequence can shift subtly, shortening some phases while extending others without producing obvious signs that anything unusual has occurred. Seen from this wider perspective, sleep medication does not simply add sleep to the night, but changes how sleep is organized, meaning its effects are better understood in terms of structure and coordination rather than hours alone. One of the most overlooked aspects of sleep medication is that its primary effect is not on sleep itself, but on consciousness, because these substances are designed first to reduce awareness, quiet alertness, and soften the brain's responsiveness to the environment, creating a state where losing consciousness becomes easier, even if the deeper processes of sleep have not yet fully engaged. From the brain's perspective, falling asleep naturally involves a gradual handover between systems that regulate attention, arousal, and internal coordination. A transition that unfolds over time as chemical signals shift and networks synchronize, whereas medication can compress this transition, lowering the threshold abruptly and moving awareness offline before the brain has completed its usual preparation. This helps explain why sleep medication can feel effective, even when the resulting sleep feels shallow or unrefreshing, because the experience of being asleep is largely defined by the absence of awareness, rather than by the quality of the internal work the brain is performing during that time. It also explains why people often report that sleep medication works immediately at first, but gradually feels less reliable over time, as the brain adapts to the altered pathway into unconsciousness and begins to treat the medication-driven transition as distinct from natural sleep onset. In this sense, sleep medication teaches the brain a different route into the night, one that prioritizes disengagement over coordination, which can subtly change how the brain expects sleep to begin, even on nights when medication is not used. None of this suggests that sleep medication is deceptive or harmful by default, but it does highlight that its effects operate at the level of awareness first and at the level of restorative sleep second, which is a distinction that rarely makes it into everyday conversations about rest. When this distinction is understood, sleep medication starts to look less like a simple aid and more like a powerful influence on how the brain transitions into sleep. Another quiet effect of sleep medication is the way it can change not just when sleep begins, but how deep it becomes and how that depth is distributed across the night, because natural sleep is not uniform, but layered with phases that deepen, lighten, and shift in a carefully timed pattern that the brain relies on for different forms of restoration. When medication is involved, this pattern can subtly reorganize itself, often extending lighter stages of sleep while compressing or delaying deeper phases, which can leave the body still while the brain remains less fully engaged in the processes that normally occur during those deeper periods. This is part of why some people wake up feeling as though they slept for many hours yet still feel mentally foggy or emotionally flat, because duration alone does not guarantee that the brain reached the depths it needed to recalibrate attention, stabilize mood, or consolidate memory. Timing also plays a role, since sleep medication can shift when certain phases occur, moving them earlier or later in the night, which may not align with the brain's internal clocks or with the timing of hormonal signals that support restoration, even though these changes rarely announce themselves clearly. Over time, the brain may begin to adapt to this altered structure, adjusting expectations about how sleep unfolds and how deep it needs to go, which can make natural sleep feel lighter or less satisfying by comparison, even when no medication is used. This adaptation is not a conscious choice but a gradual recalibration, reflecting the brain's tendency to normalize whatever pattern it encounters most often, whether that pattern is internally generated or externally influenced. Understanding this helps clarify why sleep medication can be both helpful and incomplete at the same time, providing relief from wakefulness while quietly reshaping the internal structure of sleep in ways that are easy to overlook but meaningful over the long term. Beyond its immediate effects on consciousness and sleep structure, sleep medication can quietly influence how the brain learns to associate sleep with certain conditions, because the brain is constantly forming links between internal states, external cues, and outcomes, even when no deliberate learning is taking place. Under natural conditions, the brain gradually builds an association between environmental signals, internal tiredness, and the process of falling asleep, learning to recognize subtle changes in temperature, light, and bodily rhythm as cues that rest is approaching, which allows sleep to emerge with less effort over time. When medication becomes part of this process, the brain may begin to link sleep onset not primarily with internal signals, but with the presence of an external substance, subtly shifting the way it interprets its own readiness for rest, and reducing its sensitivity to the cues it would normally rely on. This does not happen suddenly or intentionally, but through repetition, as the brain adapts to the most reliable pathway it encounters, gradually treating medication-assisted sleep as the standard route rather than an occasional aid. As a result, nights without medication can feel unusually alert or restless, not necessarily because sleep has become impossible, but because the brain has learned to wait for a signal that no longer arrives, leaving the natural transition into sleep feeling unfamiliar or incomplete. This learning effect helps explain why some people find it harder to stop using sleep medication than to start, even when the original cause of their sleep difficulty has changed, because the challenge is no longer just physiological, but associative, embedded in how the brain has been trained to approach sleep. Seen this way, sleep medication does not merely assist sleep in the moment, but participates in shaping the brain's long-term relationship with rest, influencing expectations, timing, and the sense of ease with which sleep is allowed to happen. The influence of sleep medication does not end when the night is over, because the way sleep is initiated and structured can quietly shape how the brain transitions back into wakefulness, affecting clarity, mood, and responsiveness in ways that are often subtle enough to go unnoticed, but persistent enough to matter. Under natural conditions, waking up is not an abrupt event, but a gradual re-engagement of attention, memory, and sensory processing, coordinated by shifts in chemical signals that prepare the brain to move from internal focus to external awareness, allowing alertness to return with a sense of continuity. When sleep medication is involved, this transition can feel less synchronized, as the brain may still be metabolizing the substance that helped initiate sleep, leading to a period of residual dampening in attention or emotional responsiveness, even after consciousness has returned. This can show up as mental fog, slower reaction times, or a muted emotional tone, not dramatic enough to be clearly linked to the night before, but noticeable as a general sense that the morning has started slightly out of alignment. Over time, repeated experiences like this can quietly influence how someone perceives their own energy, focus, and resilience, making it harder to distinguish between the effects of sleep quality, daily stress, and medication-related changes, since they all blend into a single subjective experience. The brain is particularly sensitive to how mornings begin because early waking states help set the tone for attention and regulation throughout the day, meaning that small disruptions at this stage can ripple outward, influencing concentration, decision-making, and emotional balance without drawing attention to their source. Understanding this helps clarify why sleep medication can feel helpful at night, yet subtly demanding during the day, not because it fails to induce sleep, but because it alters the full cycle of rest and wakefulness rather than affecting only one side of it. One of the most common misunderstandings around sleep medication is the belief that it simply replaces natural sleep, as though the brain were indifferent to how sleep is achieved as long as unconsciousness occurs, when in reality the brain is highly sensitive to the pathways, timing, and conditions that lead into rest. Another widespread assumption is that if someone sleeps longer with medication, they must be sleeping better, even though duration and quality are not the same thing, and the brain's most restorative processes depend less on hours counted and more on whether specific stages and transitions were able to unfold naturally. There is also the idea that sleep medication works directly on sleep centers alone, without affecting other systems, when in fact these substances influence networks involved in attention, emotion, and awareness, meaning their effects can extend beyond the night and subtly shape how the brain functions during the day. Many people also assume that difficulty sleeping always reflects a personal failure, a lack of discipline, or an inability to relax, which makes medication feel like a corrective tool rather than a contextual response. Even though sleep difficulties often emerge from stress, disruption, or changes in routine that the brain is still adapting to. Another misunderstanding is that the brain quickly returns to its original sleep patterns once medication is stopped, without recognizing that learning and association play a role, and that the brain may need time to relearn how to fall asleep using internal signals rather than external prompts. These assumptions persist not because people are careless, but because sleep itself is invisible and the brain rarely provides clear feedback about what is happening beneath the surface, offering only a general sense of having slept or not slept, without revealing how that sleep was organized. Once these misunderstandings are gently set aside, sleep medication can be seen more clearly as a tool with specific effects and limitations, rather than a neutral substitute for the brain's natural processes. When sleep medication is viewed not as a solution, but as an influence on how the brain enters, organizes, and exits sleep, the conversation around its use becomes quieter and more precise, shifting away from questions of dependence or discipline and toward a clearer understanding of how rest actually functions within the brain. This reframing allows sleep medication to be seen as neither inherently good nor inherently problematic, but as something that interacts with a system that is already complex, adaptive, and sensitive to context, meaning that its effects are shaped not only by chemistry, but by timing, expectation, repetition, and the brain's capacity to learn patterns over time. Instead of asking whether sleep medication works, the more useful question becomes how it changes the way sleep is experienced, and which parts of the brain's natural process it supports, bypasses, or reshapes, often in subtle ways that do not announce themselves clearly. This perspective helps explain why the same medication can feel helpful for one person and incomplete for another, why its benefits can change over time, and why the experience of sleep while using medication can feel different even when the nights appear similar on the surface. Understanding sleep medication in this way does not require rejecting it, fearing it, or overestimating its risks, but simply recognizing that sleep is not a single outcome to be achieved, but a process the brain moves through with care, rhythm, and internal coordination. Once this is understood, sleep medication stops being a shortcut to rest and starts looking more like a modifier of how rest unfolds, influencing the brain's relationship with sleep rather than replacing the process itself. This shift in perspective doesn't demand action or judgment, but it does offer clarity, replacing vague assumptions with a calmer awareness of how sleep and medication intersect. Sleep medication often enters people's lives quietly, during periods of stress, change, or exhaustion, when rest feels distant and nights begin to stretch longer than they should, and its effects are usually measured in simple terms, such as whether sleep arrived or not. What is less often noticed is how deeply sleep depends on timing, structure, and internal coordination, and how altering the path into unconsciousness can influence the entire cycle of rest and wakefulness. Even when the night itself appears calm and uninterrupted, the brain does not experience sleep as an on or off state, but as a sequence of transitions it has learned to navigate over time, responding to signals, patterns, and expectations that shape how rest unfolds. Understanding this doesn't turn sleep medication into something alarming or forbidden, but it does place it within a larger context, where its effects are seen as part of an ongoing interaction with the brain's natural systems rather than a simple replacement for them. Sleep remains something the brain does, not something it receives, and the way it is reached matters. This was hidden. Now it's uncovered.